Great. So this evening, we're excited to have Rachele DiTullio, a senior accessibility engineer at Citizens. Rachele is gender non-binary and uses she, they pronouns. Rachele believes in information integrity and accessibility through inclusive design principles. As a front-end developer, she learned web standards and coding best practices. Now she uses the knowledge as a senior accessibility engineer. Rachele is a certified professional in web accessibility, and she earned her Master's of Science degree in Information Studies from the University of Texas at Austin School of Information with a specialization in user experience design, including support work for making systems work for people with disabilities. Rachele enjoys working remotely from their home in Austin, Texas, and spending time with her partner and 4 cats. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Rachele.
All right, thank you. Let me just share my slides. All right. I lost my window. Okay. Oh, I see what happened. Let me just minimize that. Okay. Yeah, so thanks everyone for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. I've given this talk a few times. The web is inherently accessible. I've updated the slides for tonight, and I've also recorded some new video demos to show you what I'm talking about. As mentioned, I'm a senior accessibility engineer at Citizens, which is a bank, or I work for the bank part internally doing accessibility audits and advising developers and designers on accessibility. So some of this was already mentioned. I was a web developer for many years. I got my first job in 2000 as a web developer, back when we just mostly used HTML and CSS, not even CSS then. Didn't get into that until a couple of years later, but yeah, I got my master's degree a few years later. I wanted to do more like information architecture, UX work, and that kind of ended up dovetailing into accessibility. There's a professional group, the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, and through them, I've gotten 2 certifications, the Web Accessibility Specialist certification and the CPAC certification, which is more of a broad disability and accessibility credential. And if you get both of those, you become a certified web professional. So they're an interesting organization if you're looking for more accessibility info and possibly want to join a professional group. In 2021, I decided to completely get away from development and just focus on being an accessibility engineer. I was working at one of the 3 large consultancies, TPGI. So they're great. If your company is looking to get an accessibility audit or a VPAT done by a third party, I highly recommend them. They're great. And after I learned a lot there about accessibility testing, and last year I made the move to Citizens to work internally rather than for a bunch of external clients. I had dozens of clients at TPGI, and I wanted to be able to focus on one path and kind of see changes within an organization. So that's where I am now. We just go over the agenda briefly. I'll talk a little bit about what web accessibility is, talk about semantic markup, and then what I talk about is broken up into a few areas. First, we'll talk about landmarks and headings, buttons and links, graphics, tables, and finally forms. We should have plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you want to put those in chat, I'm happy to answer those later on. And yeah, let's get started. So web accessibility. This is my definition that I use when I'm speaking and coaching people. But web accessibility is the extent to which a website or web application can be used by disabled people. It's important to center disabled folks when we're talking about accessibility. Our goal is to reduce barriers and prevent creating barriers in the first place for people accessing digital information. I like to think of it as like a continuum or a spectrum. I've got a spectrum on the screen. It goes from less on the left-hand side to more on the right-hand side, and there's a little indicator towards the more end of the spectrum. And this is just to show that, yeah, accessibility is a journey. You're not going to get it it's not one and done. You're not going to just do one audit, fix everything, and never think about it again. Anytime you're adding additional content to a website or making significant changes, you want to think about accessibility and make sure that you're testing things and they're working as expected. And also, this reminds us that accessibility is, we're concerned about progress over perfection is the phrase that some of my colleagues have been using recently. It's really, the goal is not about being perfectly accessible. It's not really possible because accessibility needs can conflict. So really, we want to just make sure we're making designs and web applications that are to some extent adaptable to whatever the user needs are of the person who's using it. And they can use assistive technology if they need to, maybe just a keyboard and not a mouse, things like that. I like to use this quote from Tim Berners-Lee. So he says, "The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect." And I really tried to work by that adage that, what we're creating for the web should be accessible to everyone. And, we really want the foundations of our applications to make sense, no matter the context that it's in, no matter the device that it's being used. But it's just it's a tenet of the web that everything we make be accessible to people who are disabled. And hopefully we're creating things that aren't disabling anyone. I think about disability usually from the social model perspective, that something about our environment is causing disability. It's not necessarily inherent in the person's body or have anything to do with any limitations they might have. It has to do with how well our code is able to adapt to the needs of our users. So you may have heard of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Those are the guidelines that we use in accessibility testing in terms of, what are we actually testing for and what needs to be fixed. The guidelines are broken up into 4 areas: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And there are several versions of WCAGs, which is how we pronounce Web Content Accessibility Guidelines acronym, WCAG, WCAG. Right now we're on version 2.1. Before that, we were on version 2.0. 2.2 is coming shortly, but probably won't be part of any legal requirements or regulations for some time to come. So we'll still focus on 2.1. The guidelines are also broken up into various levels of compliance. So there's A, AA, and AAA requirements. Generally, best practice in the industry is to focus on version 2.1 level AA, and this results in 50 discrete success criteria that we test for. I do want to make it clear, though, that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are really the floor of accessibility. They're the bare minimum that we should be doing. There's always additional things that we can think about, but this is a great place to start, and making sure that your site and your content are WCAG 2.1 AA compliant is really the starting point and the minimum. But you don't let that stop you there. I mean, there are AAA requirements if those are applicable to your site. There are things that are not covered by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is part of the reason that we have version 2.2 coming out. That's going to be, I believe it's 9 new success criteria to consider. So yeah, just go ahead and look up the guidelines if you haven't ever seen them before. It's not the easiest W3C documentation to get through, but there are lots of checklists out there, people trying to make the data a little easier to consume, that might get you by a little bit better than trying to read the letter of the guidelines per se. Yeah, so basically, these guidelines first came out in 1999. So, a lot of people are only now kind of learning about accessibility, but keep in mind that the web accessibility, the content guidelines are older than any framework that you're developing with today. This has been around for nearly 24 years. And it's really important, and I'm very passionate about it. So I hope you'll enjoy what we're going to go over. So that being said, this talk is really focused on semantic markup. And when I say semantic markup, I'm talking about two things. So the first is using native HTML elements whenever we can. So on the screen, I have examples of a label that you might have before a form field input. Then I have a link that would take you someplace to another web page or somewhere else on a web page. And then I have an empty table, just as an example. So we want to use these native elements, but sometimes we need a little bit of help. So we also use what's called ARIA, or Accessible Rich Internet Application Attributes. And so let's talk a little bit about ARIA, and I'll be sprinkling ARIA knowledge within the concept of semantic HTML throughout the talk. But ARIA is basically comprised of roles and then what are called ARIA -- attributes. So an example of a role, so I've got on the screen a typical unordered list element, but we've added role equals list box. And what adding an ARIA role does is change the semantic purpose of an element. So this unordered list is no longer an unordered list, it's considered a list box, and it has certain requirements for usage that go beyond the scope of this talk. But it's an example of how you can take any element and you can change its role just by adding a supported ARIA role and creating a complex widget for your use. The other thing that we can add to controls and elements are ARIA attributes. So here I have a button element, and I've given it an accessible name using the ARIA label attribute. And so that has a label of play for our button. So even if I had, so this would be a good example of something I would use if I had a button that was just an icon, maybe a play button icon, but we still need to give it an accessible name for people who can't see the control, can't see that there's an icon on it, people who are using screen readers, for example, and we give them an accessible name using ARIA label and providing a value there. So that's just an example of a role and an attribute, and we'll look at a few more of these throughout the talk. But I want to talk about the first rule of ARIA. You may have heard this before, but the first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA. We really want to focus on using semantic HTML as much as we can, using native HTML elements whenever we can. It's not wrong to use ARIA, but the problem with ARIA is it's very easy to misuse, and bad ARIA is worse than no ARIA at all. So just make sure you're reading the specs and understand the purpose of whatever role or attribute you're trying to use, and make sure you test it with assistive technology like a screen reader. So I want to give an example of a less good example of using ARIA. So here we have a div, which a div has no accessible role. It's just considered generic, but we can turn that div into a button if we give it the role of button, which we've done here, role equals button. Additionally, buttons need to work with a keyboard, not just a mouse. So we have to give it a tab index of 0 so it actually gets keyboard focus. However, in marking things up that way, we have to make sure that we're using the correct role. We have to make sure that it's keyboard accessible, and we have to make sure that it also functions with using the enter or space key. But we could have got all of this if we just used a native button element. So we get that built-in functionality rather than creating our own buttons. There's nothing inherently wrong with creating your own buttons, but you're just making more work for yourself. And I bring this example up because I see this almost every day when I'm auditing web applications. You know, developers that for whatever reason don't want to use a native button. Sometimes there are framework limitations and things like that, but using native elements will get you pretty far in HTML, and it's important to use the correct elements if we can. So with that, I want to show you a screenshot from the test site that I used for this talk. The title of this slide is "Accessibility Provides an Inclusive Experience." Oops. But the screenshot, which is from a site that I created called Accessible Web, says, "Please disable CSS to view this web page." I created this site as kind of a joke because another developer who I follow, he created a site that required users to disable JavaScript to be able to use the site. That's right, disabled JavaScript. So I made one that required disabling CSS because I wanted developers to kind of understand, at least for a brief moment, the pain that some folks who are using assistive technology like screen readers feel when they come to a website and it's built in an inaccessible way. There's actually a lot of text and content on this website that if you were using it with a screen reader, which we'll do in a second, you could access all the content on this site and understand it perfectly. But if you're sighted, you're going to have problems unless you know, are a developer and understand how to disable CSS. Most people don't know how to do that. If you want to see this page live in action, you can go to accessibleweb.net/about. That's where I host this site. I'll also give you a link to where I have the code in GitHub in case you want to check it out. But I just want to mention, so I'll be using this site with CSS disabled to show demos of the various semantic HTML examples that I talk about in the talk. And I record them as videos because doing live demos is always questionable, but also at the end of this talk, I'll give you a link to download the slides and you'll have, you know, the videos are embedded within this presentation. So you can have access to that if you need it. And I also, since we're using a screen reader, I have enabled closed captions for these videos so that it may be difficult for you to follow along with the actual text on the web page, but you can at least read what the screen reader is announcing. I've slowed the screen reader down quite a bit, so you should be able to follow along pretty well. But if you want to rewatch those videos again, I'll give you a link to the slides and you can check it out later. So with that, let's look at the first demo video. It just goes over, it's just going to be the screen reader reading the top, you know, couple paragraphs of the website.
Accessible.
Oh, you know what? I don't think I shared my audio. Just a second. I think I forgot to do that. Let me try to share again. Forgot to check the little box. Okay, there we go.
Accessible web about document. Link accessible web. Complementary landmark. Please disable CSS to view this web page. Main landmark heading level 1. The web is inherently accessible. Block quote. Your weekly reminder that the web is accessible by default and it's our design decisions that stop it being accessible. Number 11. Why link Kevin Molinaro on Twitter, December 7, 2020. Out of block quote. Why did you have to disable CSS to view this website? No reason other than a design choice that excludes sighted people. Did you know? This is how many visitors view web pages already. List with 5 items: bullet search engines, bullet bots, bullet site crawlers, bullet analytics, bullet blind people. Out of list. This website is fully accessible to people with screen readers and braille displays. But many websites are not due to poor design choices that exclude some people.
Okay.
Accessible.
Oh, let me go to the next. So yeah, let me, I'm just going to go to the chat quick and send, if I can find the chat, send a link to the GitHub. There we go. So check that out if you want to see more about how this website is created. And it goes over all of the examples that we'll talk about after this. So the first semantic elements that I want to talk about are landmarks and headings. So landmarks and headings break content up into meaningful sections that screen reader users can access to navigate the page quickly. So just like we can see visual headings, text that's supposed to be a heading on a web page, we can scan with our eyes. Users of assistive technology can either scan the page manually and jump around just to landmarks and headings on the page, or they can bring up a list of all the landmarks and headings with a special command in their screen reading software. So these are super important to be semantically correct because people are trying to navigate by them. So this includes if you have text that visually looks like a heading on your web page, you want to make sure it's semantically marked up as a heading, and it's not just visually a larger font with bold text or something like that. We want to make sure that we're using the H1 through H6 elements to provide structure to our document. So let's look at what kind of HTML landmarks there are. There are a couple more than this, but these are the ones that get used pretty frequently. So this is in alphabetical order, it looks like. So aside, the aside element, it correlates to the landmark role of complementary. So what the screen reader announces is what's on the right-hand side, what the HTML elements are on the left-hand side. So footer gets announced as content info, header gets announced as banner, main is main, nav is navigation. And if you use a sectioning element and you provide an accessible name using ARIA labeled by or ARIA label attributes, that will get announced as a region. So there's also a region element if you want to do it that way. Primarily, you want to use as few landmarks as makes sense for your content. It's best practice to use one header, one footer, and one main landmark if you are using landmarks. And if you use landmarks, all of your content has to be marked up using landmarks. You can't just have a main landmark and then all of your other content is outside of landmarks. If you want to comply with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, it's either all or nothing. You mark up everything using landmarks or you don't use landmarks at all. So let's look at what this might look like in the HTML. So for our test web page, so I've got a header. I've actually gotten a side landmark as well too. I just didn't include it here in the markup. Then we've got the main landmark and we've got a footer. So a few things here. So like I said, screen reader users can skip around the page, so they can go from the header to the main to the footer landmark with a shortcut key, the letter D when they're using their screen reader. They can also jump around between the headings. So we've got 3 headings represented in this markup. An H1, the web is inherently accessible. Then it goes down in the hierarchy to H2, semantics, and then under semantics, we've got H3 headings. So again, using the letter H, screen reader users can jump through the page and just hear the headings announced on the page so they can get an idea of what's on the page, as well as bring up a list of all headings or landmarks using the screen reader software. So let's listen to this next video where first I navigate through the landmarks on the page using the letter D, and then I go back to the top of the page and I navigate through all the headings using H. Again, this is closed captions, so hopefully you can follow along.
Banner landmark link accessible web. Complementary landmark. Please disable CSS to view this web page. Main landmark. The web is inherently accessible. Heading level 1. Content info landmark. Call off on heading level 2. No next landmark. Banner landmark link accessible web. Main landmark. The web is inherently accessible. Heading level 1. What is web accessibility? Heading level 2. Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG, heading level 3. Semantics heading level 2. Headings heading level 3. Buttons and links heading level 3. Buttons heading level 4. Links heading level 4. Images heading level 3. List with 3 items. Alt text heading level 4. SVG icons heading level 4. SVG charts and graphs heading level 4. Tables heading level 3. Forms heading level 3. In summary heading level 2. Content info landmark. Call off on heading level 2. No next heading.
Okay, so that was reading through the whole test page and calling out all the headings. I'm sorry, it's a little bit it gets a little bit repetitive, but that's just to give you an idea of how someone who's using assistive technology can still scan a web page and get an idea of its contents without being able to see it. So let's move on to buttons and links. So there is a distinction between these two. They do get used interchangeably, both from a design perspective and a coding perspective, but best practice is to use them in this way. So a button is going to perform an action on the page, like a form submit or a disclosure widget that expands and contracts some content. A link is designed to take the user to a new URL, whether that's an in-page link, a skip link of some kind, or going to an external resource. So yeah, we want to try to use those regardless of what they look like in design. We want to use them according to their function as much as we can. So if you're using a button, I want to talk a little bit about the two most common attributes that you're going to use on a button. The first is ARIA expanded, and the second is ARIA pressed. So on the screen, I have a simple button. It just says send. That could be for a form, for example. But let's look at an example of a menu button. So if we have a menu button and we're expanding and collapsing this button to display maybe a list of links underneath it, we need to set the ARIA expanded attribute so that the screen reader hears the state of the control. So when a screen reader reaches this button with ARIA expanded false, it's going to announce menu button collapsed. When the button is expanded, we change that value to true, and the screen reader will announce menu button expanded. So it's really important for screen reader users to understand what's going on with the page. Similarly, if you have a toggle button, here we have an example of enabling light mode for a web page. We can use the ARIA pressed attribute. So ARIA pressed equals true is going to announce the button as light mode toggle button pressed. If that were set to false, it would be light mode but toggle button unpressed. And so let's hear some examples of links in their different states here with the next video.
Buttons and links heading level 3. Buttons heading level 4. List with 8 items menu button collapsed. Expanded. Button expanded search. Not pressed. Toggle button not pressed dark mode. Pressed. Toggle button pressed light mode.
Okay, so that's just a quick example of how some of the button states get announced by assistive technology. It's really, really important for folks to understand what's happening in the interface. Similarly, we have links, and basically what makes a link is not just being an A element, but also having the href attribute, which stands for hypertext reference. I was auditing a website this week where the site had a bunch of what looked like links in the footer to go to like privacy policy, security, and that kind of stuff, but they were all just marked up as buttons with a click handler, so they didn't work with a keyboard. They didn't get announced as links to assistive technology, and they didn't get keyboard focus. So even though they looked like links on the page and you could use them with a mouse, they were totally inaccessible. So here's some examples of links. We have our, just regular href goes to a website, for example. We can also have an href with a hash and then an ID. So that would create like a skip link if you're doing a skip link to skip your navigation and your website and go straight to your main content. And of course, email addresses can be marked up too. And email addresses don't get announced as email address versus a regular link. So, and it's fine to use the text of the email address, like email@domain.org, as link text, but generally for other links, you don't want to use the URL as the link text. You want to have the link text be some kind of purpose so people understand the purpose of the link, particularly screen reader users who can't view the site. So let's listen to what some links would sound like.
Links heading level 4. List with 8 items same page link. Link headings. New page link. Link accessible web tool. External link. Link Electronic Frontier Foundation opens in a new tab. Email link. Link info@eff.org.
So another thing that the browser will convey is if a link is visited or not. I should have included that as one of my examples, but it will announce visited link instead of just a regular active link. So assistive technology users understand if they've already been to a particular link. Let's move on to graphics. So when we're dealing with graphics, we want to make sure that we provide an accurate text equivalent for all graphical objects. And this includes images, charts and graphs, and meaningful icons. Those are the three examples that I'm going to show you here. So pretty much everyone knows about alt text by this point. We just want to make sure that anytime you're using the image element, you provide an alt attribute. So if the image gives meaning to the content that it's surrounding it, you want to give an accurate description. So this particular image, it says 2 cats on an easy chair under a blanket. We could possibly use this image though in a context that it would be considered decorative. It doesn't provide any meaningful information to the surrounding text. And in that case, we would just provide an empty alt attribute. You can either just have the alt attribute there by itself or alt equals quote, quote. You don't want a space within those quotes, but either just a completely empty alt attribute or a blank value will suffice. And the reason we want to do that is because some screen readers will try to announce the file name of the image if the alt attribute is not provided. Let's talk about a couple more ARIA attributes. So one, we've got role equals image img, and then we have the ARIA label attribute. So on the screen, I have an example of an icon used in a meaningful way. It looks like a little headset and it's in front of a telephone number. And if we look at the markup for this, we can see that we have a link for the telephone number, and the little headset icon is actually an embedded SVG element. And since that icon is meaningful and we want to announce it to our users, we have to do a couple of things. First, we need to give it a role of image because that's what this SVG element is functionally acting as is an image, so we give it a role. And then if we give something a role, we can use an ARIA label attribute to provide an accessible name. So someone who's visually looking at this can probably understand that means call this 1-800 number, but for users of assistive technology, they'll actually hear that. It'll say graphic call 1-800-799-7233. Conversely, if we have something that's decorative, like this icon here, which is a little map pin next to the text to find a location, we can actually hide that from assistive technology using the ARIA hidden attribute, and that looks like this. So if you're using an icon in a way that's not meaningful, it doesn't need to convey a text equivalent to the user, you can just set your ARIA hidden equals true on that attribute, and that will hide it. I see this example a lot with icons. There are decorative icons all over web pages these days, and we just want to make sure those are not getting announced to assistive technology. So it's just as important to hide things that are decorative as it is to provide text alternatives to things that are meaningful. Next, I have an example of a chart. So this chart was built using SVG, and it's not an interactive chart. I just want to make that clear. It's just created using SVG. And so what we want to do is we want to provide a text equivalent for the entire chart that demonstrates, gives you kind of a summary of what's going on in the chart. We're not worried about giving all of the data points at this point. We'll talk about that in tables. But here's an example of how we might label that chart. So first we would apply that role equals image to our SVG because it's acting as an image. And then we would give it an ARIA label attribute that describes what's going on in the chart. So here, this one says a bar chart showing the years 2016 to 2021 as the percentage of US consumers with a streaming video service increased from 52% to 78%. So just a real, giving someone a snapshot of what's going on in the SVG, and then we'll provide those data points later in a table. But let's listen to what graphics sound like there with this screen reader.
Images heading level 3. List with 3 items. Alt text heading level 4. 2 cats on an easy chair under a blanket graphic. SVG icons heading level 4. List with 2 items. Call graphic 1-800-799-7233 link. Find a location link. SVG charts and graphs heading level 4. Bar chart showing the years 2016 to 2021 as the percentage of US consumers with a streaming video service increased from 52% to 78%. Graphic.
Yeah, so you'll notice that anything that's meaningful and has a text equivalent, since we've added that role equals image, gets announced as a graphic. That's basically what adding role equals image does. It changes the semantic role of the SVG element. Now I want to talk about tables. So tables, they format tabular data into a grid that assistive technology can navigate. It's totally fine to use tables for tabular data. Please do. Here's an example of the table for that SVG chart that we were just looking at. Which best practice, if you do have a chart like that, is to provide all of the data points in a table following the graphics so that someone who's using assistive technology can understand each of the data points in the chart if you're not creating some kind of accessible interactive chart. This is the basic HTML for a table. So we can provide an accessible name using the caption element. Most folks don't do that. It's not necessary to provide a table caption unless there are multiple tables on a page, and users of assistive technology need to be able to differentiate between tables because they can navigate the page just by tables. They can jump from one table to the next, and if there's not an accessible name, they won't understand the purpose of the table. This can be accomplished other ways too, but here I'm just demonstrating the caption element. The first, in a simple table like we just looked at here, your first row of data is going to be using the TH element or table header element. And that's important because table headers can get conveyed by assistive technology in context of the data that it reads later on in the chart in the TD elements. So let's go ahead and listen to what this table sounds like in the context of our web page.
Tables heading level 3. US consumers with a streaming video subscription table with 7 rows and 2 columns. US consumers with a streaming video subscription caption. Row 1 column 1 year. Column 2 US consumers. Row 2 year column 1 2016. US consumers column 2 52%. Row 3 year column 1 2017. US consumers column 2 64%.
Okay. So I won't make you listen to all of that, but you get an idea of it. Will announce the row and column numbers and the table headers for that data, and it makes it a little bit easier to navigate a table. So lastly, I want to talk just briefly about forms. So generally, we want to use the label element for forms, and labels provide both a visible label for our form field inputs, as well as provides an accessible name to those form field inputs when the label and input are programmatically linked. And we'll look at how to do that. The input determines the type of data being requested. So if we look at the most basic of examples, we've got a label here. The text of the label is your email, and the label has a for attribute. This for attributes value of, it happens to be email as well, corresponds to the ID of the input that the label is providing a label for. What this allows us to do is a couple of things. So one, when you have your label and inputs programmatically linked like this, you can actually click on the label itself to get focus in the form field, which can be important for people who have certain motor disabilities, particularly when you're talking about a small hit area, like for a radio button or a checkbox. It's a lot easier if they can click on the full label of the input in order to get focus on that input. Additionally, it provides an accessible name for your form field when the label is programmatically determined. What that means is when you move focus into a form field input, that label for the input will be announced by assistive technology. If it's not programmatically linked, then your input won't have an accessible name, and it'll be more difficult for users of assistive technology to understand what the purpose of the form field is. There are various inputs you probably know about already. Text, the input type of text is the most generic and used for most things. There are some special types like email, search, URL, and tell that can do different things based on the input that you select, you might get different error messages. You might have different input requirements that are reinforced by those input types. And then of course we have radio buttons and checkboxes, which we'll look at in a second. But I just want to take you briefly through a couple form fields so you can hear how they get announced by assistive technology.
Forms heading level 3. Your name, required, edit required blank. Email, ARIA required equals true, edit required blank. Send button. Please fill out this field. Alert, your name, required, edit required blank.
Okay, so that's just kind of the basics of what you hear from assistive technology. There are attributes like ARIA required and ARIA invalid that you can use to provide some of that state information to assistive technology users. Also, we saw an example of the default browser HTML5 form field validation, which we generally suggest not using because it does have some accessibility problems, but I wanted you to see what that looks like. One of the accessibility problems is that it disappears. So we don't know which field actually has an error right now because the error message is not visible. So we want error messages to be visible and persistent. So lastly, I just want to let you know how grouping fields works and sounds a little bit. It's important to use a field set if you have groups of related fields like checkboxes or radio buttons. And then there's a legend element, which is the first child of the field set, which will provide a grouping label for those controls. And that's really important for assistive technology. This is what it looks like. So we've got our field set, a legend, what products are you interested in? And then we've got our first input, which is a checkbox. And again, we've programmatically linked the label and the input, even though the label element is surrounding the input and implicitly linking them programmatically. That doesn't work with all screen readers. So it's still important to be explicit and link that for attribute on the label to the ID of your input. And let's hear what that sounds like.
What products are you interested in? Grouping banking checkbox not checked. Checked. Not checked. Investments checkbox not checked. Loans checkbox not checked. Credit cards checkbox not checked.
Okay, so you
Out
can
of
hear
grouping heading level 2 in summary.
Yeah, so you can hear how it announced when we went into the grouping and then as well as when we left the grouping. So that's really important information for users of assistive technology, and you get all of that from field set and legend. So that's the basics of this talk. In summary, like I said, web accessibility is an ongoing process. It's about progress over perfection. We want to use semantic markup as much as we can, which is using those native HTML elements plus ARIA as needed. Headings and landmarks help people, particularly users of assistive technology, navigate your content. Buttons and links do different things, so use them appropriately. Graphics, when they are meaningful, they need text equivalents for people who can't see the graphics. Tables are great for using for data, tabular data, and we want to structure forms in accessible ways as much as we can. So with that, thank you for listening to my talk. I will actually post this link to the slides in the chat in case you want to download them. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was awesome. That was awesome. All are welcome to put any questions you might have in the chat or unmute and just ask them out loud. Okay, I have two that came in, Rachel. The first one was, how can we make a marquee accessible?
I wasn't sure if that was a joke or not. We generally don't, the marquee element itself in HTML is deprecated, so we don't want to use that. It's fine to have moving content that replicates a marquee as long as there is a control to stop or pause the animation for people who don't want to see it. But that's pretty much it.
And we've got one from Ashley. Do you have any advice for making headings sequential when you're using partials?
I don't understand that question, I'll be honest. But having headings in sequential or hierarchical order is considered a best practice. So don't beat yourself up too much if your H2 is not followed by an H3. It's something that we try to adhere to, but it's not the letter of the law. Just like it's best practice to use one H1 at the beginning of your content to describe the purpose of the content. But again, this is not a hard and fast rule. It's not something I would fail in an audit.
All right, we've got another one that came in. David asked, what could incentivize a company to dedicate dev time to accessibility?
Well, unfortunately, the thing that motivates most companies is the threat of a lawsuit. So in the United States, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which the law itself was written in 1990 before the internet, or not before the internet, before the web. So there are no rules currently within the letter of the law describing accessibility requirements for digital information. However, there's a plethora of case laws and decisions that have been found in the plaintiff's perspective and have required by case law that public websites, anything that's publicly available is WCAG 2.1 AA compliant if you're a public entity, if you're a private entity, I'm sorry, if you're just a regular company. If you're working for the federal government, of course, we have section 508, which only mandates WCAG 2.0 level AA, which basically ignores like responsive web requirements. So the best thing I can say is, companies should think about accessibility as a differentiator. It makes your product better. It makes it available to many more people. Some people think, oh, we don't have people with disabilities, they don't use our product, but people with disabilities make up 25% of the population in the United States. So it's a very good chance you have disabled people using your site. It just may not be working as well as it could for them. And if you can do one thing for accessibility, make sure that your website works with a keyboard. Try to use it without a mouse. If you can't get to every element, every button, every link, every control and operate it with a keyboard, then that's your first accessibility problem. So I encourage companies to think about accessibility as something that will make them more competitive.
Yeah, and I think you just answered Grace's question that she just
Oh,
asked.
okay. Good.
I had one that I wrote down kind of, I think it was your first or second slide. You were talking about accessibility being a spectrum. And I frequently get asked by people like, well, can we just make it accessible? When will it be accessible? How do you sort of have those conversations with clients that like, it's not a yes or no, it's a where is it on the spectrum?
Yeah, so and that question really depends on, when has the team considered accessibility? A lot of the projects that I get, just because of where my company is at right now, something gets developed, they're ready to go to production, and then they ask for an accessibility audit. And I often find a lot of issues because accessibility wasn't considered from the very beginning. It wasn't considered a requirement for MVP, things like that. So I encourage folks to think about accessibility as early as possible and then try to get things tested, as you're creating components. Don't wait till QA, don't wait till you're ready to go live, because you're more likely to find a lot of accessibility issues. So, the sooner you can get in there, the more more bugs you're gonna squash, like with anything else. Well, thank you. I really appreciate y'all letting me talk on this topic. I really enjoy it.
Thank you. And thanks for everyone who came this evening. I am not seeing any more questions come up. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. I will take the links from the chat and make sure they end up on the meetup page for tonight. So if you want to find any of those resources again, we'll have those saved for you. Sweet. Well, thank you all for coming.
All right, thank you.